Hey everyone, welcome to another lecture of this JWT Authentication System where we are actually going to create an app instance, right? So in the previous lecture, we created a dummy server using our Chi router. So in this lecture, we are going to give it a more form and a more shape, right? Next, we are going to set up air for it so that we can actually hot reload our project, and then we are going to set up our authentication endpoints and our user endpoints, right? So let's get started. So in the previous lecture, this is where we left it off. So we had this package main, and inside that we had a main function which is simply creating a new Chi router. Now what I actually want is that I want an app instance inside my this cmd slash app package, which is this one. What I am actually going to do is I will have a struct by the name of app, which is going to have some properties, and my main.go, which is this one, this will first create an app instance coming from this cmd slash app slash main.go, and then it will basically run it. So at first I want to create an interface for my app, and I am going to name it as app interface, and it is going to have a method which is my run method. Then I am going to have a struct by the name of app, and it is going to have some properties, which is number one is my server config, which is coming from my config layer. Then I am going to have my db config, which will be coming from my config layer as well. That's it for my app struct. And then I am going to implement my this run function so that this app struct implements this app interface. So I am going to implement my app interface, and I am going to make it a pointer, and inside this run I am going to do, at first I am going to validate my server config. So if you see, my app struct has a server config property and a db config property. Now there can be some cases where my server config, so if you see, these are the fields of my server config and they have some validation tags, and the same thing goes as well with my db config layer, which has some properties, and on those properties I have some validation tags, right? So what I want is I am going to first validate my server config struct so that all these validation tags, they actually get validated. Then I am going to validate my db config. Then I am going to set up my zap logger, and then I am going to set up my database, and finally at last I am going to create my server instance, and I'm going to start this server. Now inside my this first step, which is to validate my server config, if you see how to validate structs, you see we have a package which is this go playground slash validator slash v10. So using this package we can validate these tags on our user struct, right? So that is what I am going to do. So just first install this go playground slash validator package, and then once that is done, the syntax of this is first you have to create a validator instance, and then you have to pass your struct to this validate.struct function, and that is going to return an error, right? So that is what we are going to actually do. So at first I am going to create an instance of my validator, and for doing that I will just type validator.new. Once that is done, I am going to validate my struct. So for that, validate.struct function is what I am going to use, and not validator, it is validate.struct, and I am going to pass my server config like this, and what it is actually going to return is an error, right? So at the same line I am going to check if I do have an error, and if I have an error, so at that time my error will be not null, and if I have any error, then I will just log.fatal it out by telling that while validating our server config, it has failed, right? So it is failed to validate the server config. And I am going to also concatenate my error, which is error.error. And in a similar fashion, I am going to validate my database config. So it is validate.struct app.dbconfig, and it is log.fatal failed to validate the database config. Right. Next, I am going to set up my zap logger. So for doing that, inside my config layer, I have a get logger which needs a app env, right? And that app env will be actually coming from my app.serverconfig.myapp.env. So inside this app, I have this property, right, which is a server config, and this server config is basically this struct only. So inside that struct, I have this property which is app.env. So that is what exactly I am going to pass over here, right? And this returns me a logger instance, right? So I am just going to store it in my logger variable. And the next step is to set up my DB. So inside my config, if you see in your DB config layer, we actually created this setup DB function, right? So that is what I am going to actually use. So setup DB, and it requires number one, my DB config, and number two is my zap logger. So my DB config is present inside my app. So it is app.dbconfig, and I need to pass a zap logger. So that is basically this logger which I created just over here. And this returns me two things again. One is this pointer to my SQL.db, and another thing is my error, right? So that is what I am going to actually store it, and then I'm going to check if error is not null, and if it is not null, then I have an error while setting up the DB. So it is basically something went wrong while setting up the DB, and I am going to concatenate that error as well, right? And once that is done, at the end of this function, we have to close our DB, right? And for doing that, I am going to use my defer keyword. So what this does is, once everything is fine, and like if there is any error, this log.fatal will basically get triggered, and if anything of that occurs, then my database connection will basically be closed, right? And once that is done, I am going to create my server instance, right? And for doing that, I am going to use the net http module http.server, and inside here I'm going to pass certain things, which is at first the address, which is nothing but the port. So it is app.serverconfig.port. Next, my handler will be there. Now I'm going to remove these things out. So I need read timeout, write timeout, and ideal timeout, and rest everything I can just cut them out. So these are the main things that I need. So for the read timeout, I have that inside my server config as well. Then for my write timeout, I have that in my server config as well. And the same thing goes with my ideal timeout. Alright. And I need a handler. And in this handler, you can pass a chi router. So the chi router that we can actually create like this, we can use that over here, right? So for now, I am putting the handler as nil. But after some time, we are going to create our chi router, and then we are going to use that chi router over here. And once this is done, I'm going to start my server. So first I'm going to log a message out by saying that starting the server. And I also want to concatenate my port. So it is app.serverconfig.port. And once that is done, we have to listen and serve this server, right? So for doing that, we just type server.listen and serve, and this is going to return an error. So again, we are going to store that error over here, and then we are going to check if this error is not null. And if my error is not null, then that means that something went wrong while starting this server, right? So logger.fatal, and something went wrong while starting the server. And similarly, I am going to concatenate my error over here, right? Now, one important thing to notice is we do not have a chi router over here, right? So after some time, we are going to actually create the chi routers, and that chi router will be actually used over here. But for now, this is the thing that we actually have, right? So this is the app that we have, and inside my main.go, which is this one, which is basically this one, what I am going to do is I'm going to create an instance of this app, and then I'm going to run this app, right? So for doing that, I first need my server config and my db config. So that is what I am going to create over here. So just remove everything over here, and the first thing that we are going to do is create the server config instance, which is basically the instance of this struct. Then the next step is to create the dbconfig instance, which is basically to create an instance of my this struct. And then we have to create the app instance, which is basically this one. Oh, sorry, I just cutted it out, which is this one, which we have just created right now, right? So at first create this server config instance, and for doing that, you just call your config layer, and inside that config layer, we have created this load server config function, which will give us two things, which is first is our server config and an error. So we are going to check if error is not null, which means that we do have an error, right? So if error is not null, that means we have an error, and we are actually going to log it out. So for logging, I will just write a message by saying that something went wrong while creating our server config instance. And I am also going to concatenate that message out by saying error.error function. Now, once that is done, the same thing I wanna do with my db thing. So if you remember, we created this load dbconfig function, which again returns us two things, which is number one is my dbconfig, and number two is my error. So again, I will check if error is not null, which means I do have an error, and this error came while creating my database config. Now once that is done, I want to create an instance of my app. So that will be basically server app equals to my, I want this to be a pointer to my app instance, right? So it will be basically app.app. So inside my package app, I am going to call this struct, which is this app struct, which is basically this one which we have just created right now, right? And inside my server config, I'm going to pass my server config, which we created over here. Then I'm going to pass my db config over here, and once that is done, I am going to actually call my run function. So you see, in our main.go, we are doing three things. We are creating the server config instance, then creating the db config instance, then we are creating the app and running it. And in my this cmd/app/main.go, we technically have just one function for our this app struct, which at first validates our server config, then validates our db config, then sets up a zap logger, then sets up our db, then creates a server instance, and then it starts the server, right? So I hope the point is pretty much clear to you guys. And once that is done, let me first see what all the files we changed. So it is basically this and this file. And once that is done, we see that we are running it on our port 3000. Now to run this, you can basically write your go run main.go, and this should execute this function and should start the server on my http localhost :3000. So let's give it some time. So you see, we are actually starting to see logs coming from our zap logger. So that means that it's working fine, and you can see that we have got a log which says that our app has successfully connected to our database. And then if we go to our localhost 3000, you are going to see that 404 page not found, and this means that our server has successfully started. But just because we have this handler, which is this one, yeah, this one handler as nil, we do not have any chi router over here, right? And that is why there are no routes that we have registered for now. So that is why we are getting this 404 error. But technically our server has managed to connect to our database and it has managed to start on our local host. So that is one green flag that we got up till this point. And what I want you guys to do is I just want you guys to commit all your changes till this point. So if I check my branch, I am inside my feed project setup branch. And if I do git status, we have this much changes, right? So just go ahead and push them out. And for the message, I am going to give as feed create simple app orchestration. Just push it out. And once that is pushed, now what we actually want is that inside our routers, let's first start creating the files, right? So see, inside our routers, we are going to have primarily 4 files, or actually 5 files. So at first, inside my routers, I am going to have a new file by the name of main.go. So what this main.go will do is that it will register all my routers, right? So I will have all my routers spread across in this routers directory, and my this main.go, it will just be there to orchestrate, or it will be just there to register all my router endpoints. So this is the first file that we are going to have. Next, inside my routers, I am going to have first a health router, which is basically for checking if everything is working fine or not. Then I'm going to have my users router, then my roles router, then my user roles router. And also I am going to have a auth router. So let's start. So at first, let's get this auth router, then my users router, then my roles router, then my user roles router. So we have these many files, and these routers will call my controllers. So inside my controllers also, I am going to have a similar set of files, but here I will not have this main.go because my individual router is going to use my individual controller, right? So here is no point of orchestrating my controllers, right? Because we do not need any orchestration of my controllers. So there are different routers, and for those different routers, we have different controllers. So each router is going to utilize each controller. So we do not need a main.go over here. So the controllers which we are going to have is at first my health controller, then my auth controller, then my users controller, then my roles controller, and then my user roles controller. Now once that is done, my controllers is going to call my service layer, right? So if you remember, this is exactly the flow that we followed earlier, right? So if I scroll up, this one, like my routers calling my validation, then my controllers, then my services, then my repositories, right? So we have our routers layer created, then our controller layer is created. Now we have to create this service layer. Now for service layer, one important thing to note is that I am not going to create this health service.go. Why? Because inside my health controller, simply I want to create a simple endpoint which will just response out with a 200 message saying that everything is working fine. So I am not going to create a separate service layer for my health endpoint, right? But for everything others, we are going to have it. So just go inside your services and first create your auth service, then your users service, then your roles service, and then finally your user roles service. Right, so we have this auth service, then we have our user service, then our roles service, and then our user roles service. Now once that is done, my service layer is going to talk with my repository layer. So for that repository layer, again, please note that I am not going to create a separate repository layer for my auth service. Why? Because inside my auth service, primarily whatever logic that we are going to write is basically related to our users only, right? So it will be related to our users and our roles. So we do not need a separate auth repository altogether. We can just utilize our user repository inside our auth service. So that is what we are going to follow. So inside my repositories, I am going to create just 3 files. One for at first my users, then for my roles, and then finally for my user roles. Now once that is done, see, at first we are going to create our repository layers. Alright, and then we are going to create our service layer, then our controller layer, and then our routers layer. So let's first come over here and create this repository layers. So for our repository layer, the flow how it is going to work is that we are going to create first interfaces for our repository interface. Alright, so let's get started. So inside my users repository, first I'm going to create an interface by the name of user repository interface. So see, this is going to have an interface which is going to have functions like get all, then get by user ID, etc. And then I am going to have a struct by the name of just user repository, which is going to implement this interface, right? Which means that whatever functions that I have over here, that struct by the name of user repository has to implement all of these methods as well. So see, the functions which I am going to have inside my users repository are at first my create user, then my get all users, then my get user by ID, then my update user by ID, then my delete user by ID, then my get user by email. So it will be get user by email, and then get user by username and email. So if you remember, our user model had this thing, which is this ID, username, email, and password. So this is what we are going to have. So it is going to fetch the user by the particular username and email. So that's it for now. So these are all the functions that we are going to have for my user repository, at least for now. Next, what I want to do is I want to create a struct by the name of my user interface, and inside this struct I am going to have some properties, which is number one is my db. So it is going to be my sql.db. It is going to be a pointer of it. Next, I'm going to have my own zap logger, and then I'm going to have my server config, and I want this struct to implement my user repository interface. Now if you see inside this function declaration, or not function declaration, but here it is using this type of naming which I don't like, so I'm going to change it over here. So it is going to be just the lowercase version or the camel case of it, and I want to make it a pointer to my user repository, right? So you see, I just changed the variable name over here and I just made it a pointer variable. So I am not going to actually go and write the code just now, because at first I just want to create all the function signatures and just set it up for now, and then once everything is done, once the setup is done, we are going to write our logic for it. So I believe that makes a sense, and here what I am going to do is I am going to use my Zap logger to log out a simple message by telling that this message is coming from my user repository and it is basically from this create user endpoint, right? And the same thing I am going to implement for all other my methods. So what this will actually ensure is that our setup is quite well done, right? And once that is done, writing code inside the function is going to be a task which will be much more simplified, right? So that is why this groundwork is being done prior to it. Now once everything is done, at last I am going to create a new function by the name of new user repository, which will create an instance of this user repository and is going to return it out. So the function name is going to be new user repository, and it takes three things, which is basically these three ones. So you can just copy paste over here, and it does need a bit of of manual formatting. And once that is done, what it actually going to return is this user repository interface itself. And inside this, what I am going to do is I am going to create an instance of this user repository basically. So for doing that, it is very simple. So it is just user repository equals to the and of user repository struct, and inside this you are going to pass these properties which are coming from your function parameters. And once that's done, you just return this user repository out. So this same thing, let's now come into our roles and let's see what all endpoints we are going to have for our roles. So I am going to do a bit of copy pasting over here. So inside my roles repository, the interface that it is going to be known as is role repository interface. And here, similar to user, I am going to have certain methods which are create role, get all roles, get role by id, update role by id, and delete role by id. And once that is done, this is going to be a role repository and it is going to have these three properties. And what it actually is going to do is it's actually going to implement, so this struct, which is this role repository struct, is going to implement this role repository interface, right? So it is quite the same thing, but it is just useful because we are actually setting up everything, right? So it will make our task much more easier in the future. And once this is done, similar to users, I am going to log out a simple message. So it is going to be this role repository.logger.info, and it's coming from my role repository from my this create role endpoint. And same do that for all of your methods. And once that is done, you are going to have this new role repository function, which is going to take your these three things only. So it is going to take your sql.db, zap.logger, and server config, and it returns this role repository interface, right? So it is going to create a pointer of this role repository, and once that is done, it is going to return it out. And the similar fashion, I am going to do the same thing for my user roles, wherein I am going to have my properties of get roles of the user, assign role to the user, remove role from user, check user has role, and check user has all roles, and check user has any role. So let's start one by one. So this is my user roles repository. So here again, I am going to create a simple interface by the name of user role interface, and inside this I am going to have the methods of get roles of a single user, then assign role to user, then remove role from user, then check user has single role, then check user has any role. So this any role will be like, we are going to give it an array of roles, and in that array, if it has any single role, then it's going to return a true value. And finally, we are going to have a check user has all roles. Right, so these are the methods for our user role repository interface, and once that's done, just go ahead and implement this struct. And what I recommend you guys to do is just pause this video and do this thing by your own, because this is something that we have done just now, like we just did it twice, right? So please go ahead, pause the video and do it yourself, and that is what will create your muscle memory much stronger. So once that is done, I am going to have a similar set of logs for this as well. So it is going to be user role repository.logger.info, the user role repository, and it is not create user, it is so like there is some bug over here. So let me again implement this function out. So it is this user role repository, and it's going to implement my user role repository interface. So now I think it will be working fine. Now inside each one of this, I am just going to create, or I'm just going to log out my dummy messages. So this user role repository.logger.info, the user role repository, and get roles of user. Then similarly for my assign role to user, then remove role from user, check user has single role, check user has any roles, check user has all roles. Right, so I think this should make some sense for now. And at last, again, I'm going to have this new user role repository function, which is going to create an instance of this struct, right? So it is new user role repository, and it returns my user role repository interface, and it is going to be a pointer to this user role repository, and at the end just return this thing out. Now with that thing done, we can actually push this much code, right? So if you see, we have changes to these files. Now you can just push the code up till this point by giving a simple message of, set up the repositories, and just push this commit out. And once this repository has been set up, the next thing which you have to do is to create your service layer. Now what this service layer will have is, it is going to have a pretty much similar type of format. So at first we are going to create an interface for that service, then we are going to create a struct for that service, and then we are going to implement all those method outs, and then we are going to have this new service which is going to create that service and return that interface. So let me close all our tabs and let me just open my users repository. And for your services, at first what you have to do is just simply create a interface. So create an interface by the name of your user service interface, which is going to have this similar methods over here as well, and then create a struct by the name of user service, which is going to have some properties, which is number one is my user repository, which is going to be a type of this user repository interface. So it is user repository, which is this user repository interface. Then it is going to have a logger and a server config over here as well. And once this is done, I'm going to implement this user service interface. And the same renaming thing that I am going to do is, first, instead of I'm going to camel case my user service, and instead of my user service as a struct, I'm going to have it as a pointer variable. And inside my each of these endpoints, what I am going to do is I'm going to first log out a simple message over here. So it tells that the user service.logger.info, and it just called this user service, and the endpoint is create user. And then I want to make a call to my repository layer. So how to do it? So it's just user service dot user repository dot, if you see, this is create user, right? So you just call this create user function, and this should work pretty fine. So the same thing, you go ahead this is our server layer for our users endpoint, right? So you see, we just call our repository layer inside our service layer. So once this is done, please go ahead and do the same thing with your roles service as well. So the process is pretty much very simple. So what you do is you first create an interface for your role. Actually, wait, yeah, so I just copy pasted the wrong thing. So just copy paste this user thing and just change this for your role service. And please note that for your role repository, you are going to have just these 5 functions. So please be aware and just paste these 5 methods only. And then for a struct, name it as your role service, and this is going to have this is going to have the role repository basically. So it is going to be our role repository. And once this is done, you can just copy paste these methods. So that is what I am actually going to do, because this is a bit tiring task, right? So for this user service, this is my have the create role, the get all roles, then the get role by id, then update role by id, and then my delete role by id. And once that is done, what you should have is you just call this role service. So you are basically logging some messages out, right? So you just role service.logger.info, and then just paste this name, and it's the create role endpoint. And for your role repository, it's just role service dot role repository dot create role. Alright, so that makes a lot of sense. So go ahead and copy paste them out and just rename them so it suits for all our endpoints inside our service layer as well, right? So I think I am done, and once this is done, I am going to have my new role service function as well, right? So it's new role service, and it's taking three things, which is this role repository, which is this role repository interface, then my logger, then my server config, and it returns my role service interface. And it's going to create a struct of my role service, wherein I'm going to have my property of my role repository, and once that is done, I am going to return this role service out. So you see, it was so easy to just create our role service. So the thing is this, right? So you just create one thing and you just copy paste it and you just put it over others, right? And this works because for now we are just setting up our endpoints, right? So that is why we can afford to do that. But once you are good to go with the setup and you just start writing the endpoints, you can hardly do any copy pasting until and unless your endpoints are doing similar sort of action like fetching all items, then applying some filtrations or getting an item by its primary key, right? So like that sort of actions basically. But this was our role service. Then similarly for your user role repository, go ahead, pause the video and create this user role service. So I hope that he paused it. Now let's go ahead and do this. So user roles.logger.info into this one, and it is my user roles.user role repository dot get roles of user. Alright, so this is what we are going to have for all my other methods for this. So it's this assign, so this get roles of user is done. Next, assign role to user. Next, remove role from user. Next, check user has single role. Next, check user has any role. And finally, it's check user has all roles. And once that is done, at the end you have this new user role service method. So just checking if everything is fine over here, and they seem to be fine. So for this user role service, it's going to take my user role repository, which is going to have this parameter, and it's going to return my user role service interface. Yeah, now inside this I'm going to create my user role service, wherein I will have my user role repository as the same as coming from my function parameters, and this should basically work pretty fine, right? So we just created this user role service, we passed the user role repository coming from our function parameters, and we have written this user role service, which is indeed following this user role service interface, right? So just like our repository layer, we have created this dummy service layer as well, right? So let's again push them out. So that was our service layer for now. So our repository layer is done. Our service layer is done. The next in the chain is our controller layers, right? So let's go ahead and create our controller layer. Now our controller layer, at first, see how it's going to work is similar to our other layers. At first we are going to have a interface, so it's my user controller. So first my interface will be there, which is my user controller interface, which will have some methods, and these methods are coming from this one. So these, whatever these methods are there inside my user service, the same I am going to have in my user controller. But here is one catch, which is, see, for our chi router, how it actually works is, let's open the chi router docs, and if you see, like, this is how we are actually going to write our controllers. So you see, it is, so at first we created this chi router, then what we did is we created this simple r.get /article/ whatever URL path parameters are there, then this get article. Now what is this get article? So this is basically my controller function, which accepts two things. Number one is my response writer, number two is my HTTP request itself. So this is exactly what we are going to do. So for our user controller interface, the things which we are going to have are primarily these 7 functions, which are my create user, and each one of these are going to accept two things: my response writer and my HTTP request. And for simplicity, I am going to rename them as res writer, which means response writer, and basically my request. So this is something that will be passed to every function of mine because they are part of my controller functions only. And then I am going to create a struct. So it is my user, where's the struct? Yeah, so it is my user controller struct, and inside this, the things which I am going to have is my user service. So it's going to be my user service, which will be a type of my user service interface. So just like how inside my user service struct, I had this user repository property, which was a type of my user repository interface. Similar to that, inside my controller, I am going to have this property of user service, which is going to be of my type user service interface. So I hope that makes the point pretty clear. And besides it, I will also have my Zap logger as well as my server config. Now once that's done, just go ahead and implement this interface, which is this user controller interface. And I just want to rename it so that it looks a bit more professional and a bit more meaningful. So just camel casing the terms and just using pointer variables. So this is how it is actually going to work. So at first, inside my controller, I will call my service layer. So it is pretty simple. So for my create user endpoint, it is user controller.userService.create user. And once I have called my service layer, the next step is to write my response. And for writing your response, you will see that this is how you write it. So this is response writer dot write header, then this status code, and then response writer dot write, then you just convert it to byte. Or else otherwise what you can actually do is, there is an encoder in Golang. So you see, this encoding slash JSON is a package using which you can, encode your data. So this is what a better approach that I feel is. So here what you have to do is, for writing your JSON response out, you can do something like your response writer dot header dot set. So this is the first header that you have to set, which is your content type, and you have to set it to your application JSON. Then what you can do is, you can then simply stream this encoded JSON directly out to the HTTP response by doing JSON.new encoder this response writer, and then you're encoding the response, which is the data itself. So for this particular thing, I want to create a simple utility function, and the file which I am going to create is response underscore util. Now inside this, the function that I want to create is my simple write JSON response, and inside it I am going to take in few things, which are, number one is my status code. So this is the status code in which our HTTP responses will go out. Then I will have a res writer, which will be my http.response writer, and for simplicity I will rename its variable. And then I am going to have a data payload, which is what I am going to give it out in my response payload, and it is going to be a property of map whose keys are just strings and whose value can be anything. And the way to response it out is, first response writer dot header, and over there you set your content type to be application slash JSON, and then what you are going to do is response writer dot write header, and over here what you will do is, you will just parse your status code. So this will be the status code of your response, and then you just encode the data. So it's JSON dot encoder, then your response writer dot encode and your data, which is just this data. And I am getting some errors, and it is because it is new encoder function and not this encoder thing. All right, so I believe that is it. And once this is done, you can come back to your user controller. So inside this create user endpoint, you first call your service layer and you called its create user method, and then you just want to give out the response for now. So it's basically utils dot write JSON response. For the status code, you can give something like 201, which means a status of, or not like this, you can actually do http dot status created, which is basically 201. And then for the response writer, you just give out your response writer, and for the data, it's just any of, number one, the success is you want it to be true, and for now you want to give a simple message out telling that the user was created successfully, right? So with that done, you can just copy paste this into every other functions, and you just need to do some renaming over here and there. So that is exactly what I am doing over here. So inside this get user by username and email, what it is going to do is, it's going to call the same function inside my service layer, and then for the HTTP response, it's going to be status okay, which is 200, and for the success it's true, and for the message is fetched user successfully by username and email. Now please keep this in mind that this is just the setup thing, right? Once this setup is done, we are going to have custom logic for each one of these endpoints. But before that, we are just doing some level of setup so that things get much more clarified and much more clear once we start writing the custom logic. Alright, so the same for the get user by email. Inside it, it's going to call the same function from my service layer, and for the JSON response, it's going to use the status okay with a success of true and a message of fetched user successfully by my email. And for my delete user, it's going to call the delete user by ID. For the status, it's status okay. For the message, it's a user was deleted successfully. Then for the update, it's going to call the same function, then it's status of okay, and it's a user was updated successfully. And then for the get, it's get user by ID and the status of okay, and a user was fetched successfully. And for the get all users, it's user service dot get all users. For the status, it's status of okay, and it is all users were fetched successfully. And that is pretty much it for our controller layer. So it's very simple. You see, it just called the service layer and it's just giving out a response. Now again, in the upcoming lectures, we are going to write custom logic for each one of these functions, but it's just that I want to make things clearer and much more simplified by doing the setup just now. And once that is done, I'm going to have a similar function by the name of a new user controller, which takes these properties only as my function parameters. So just accept them and do a bit of your manual formatting. And once that is done, what it is actually going to return is a user controller interface, and inside it, it's going to create a new user controller. So it's user controller equals to and of my user controller. It's going to be camel cased, and now it should work fine. So inside my user controller, I have to pass three things. Number one, my user service. Number two is my zap logger, and number three is my server config. So that is exactly what we are going to do. So for the user service is my user service, and next for the logger, I will pass the same logger as my function parameters, and for the server config, it is the plain old server config. And once that is done, I'm going to just return this user controller out. So that was it for our user controller. Now what I want you guys to do is, in a similar fashion, please take the reference from these controller and go ahead and do the same with your roles controller and with your user roles controller. Alright, so I hope that you will do that. Now let us do it. So for our roles controller, I'm going to again do a bit of copy pasting. So it's now our role controller interface. So it's going to have primarily these 5 functions, which is create role, get all roles, get role by ID, update role by ID, and delete role by ID. Alright, so this is what we are going to have. And once this is done, I am going to create role controller, in which it is going to have a role service interface. And once this is done, it is going to implement my user controller interface, and again do a bit of this variable renaming so that it looks actually good and much more meaningful. And inside this function, it's something that I will have very similar to my user controller. So it's basically my role controller dot role service dot create role. So inside this create role method, it is going to call the create role of my service layer, and it's going to respond out with a status of created, and it's going to say a role was created successfully. Next, it is the get all role. So it is role service dot get all roles, and the status is okay. and it is all roles fetched successfully. Next, similar, we will have something for our role ID, which is it's going to call the role get role by ID function from our role service, and it's going to respond out by saying a single role was fetched successfully. And then for my update role by ID, it will be role controller dot role service dot update role by ID, and it's going to be a status of OK, and it is a single role was updated successfully. It's going to be the message. And for the delete role by ID, it's role service dot delete role by ID, status of OK, and it is a single role was deleted successfully. And once everything is done, you just create this new role controller function. Alright, so it's new and then role controller, which accepts your role service, which is a property of role service interface. So it's role service of role service interface, and it's logger server config, and it returns my role controller interface. And inside it, it's going to create a function for our it's going to create a new instance of my role controller, wherein the service is the same as the one coming from our function parameters. Alright, and this is my role controller, and this is pretty fine. So with that done, the last thing which we have to do is to create a user roles controller for our user roles services, right? So similarly, at first I will create my interface. So it's user role controller interface, which is going to have these many properties, or these many functions actually, and the name of the struct is user role controller, and the service that it is going to have is the user role service. And once that is done, this controller should implement this user role controller interface, right? So it's user role controller interface, and just again a bit of renaming things so that it looks much more meaningful. Now similarly, inside our user role controller, you first call this user role controller dot user role service, and for your get roles of user, call the get roles of user from your service layer, and you just response out http dot status of OK, and for the message you can give something like fetched roles of the user. Is a bit monotonous because this is the setup thing, right? So a setup thing will be mostly similar across everything, but once the setup is done, once the real logic kicks in, this is going to feel a lot more difficult, right? So just please be patient. So inside this check user has all role, it calls my service layer and calls this check user has roles, and for the message I will tell something like fetch, or not fetch, check user has all roles. Next, for the check user has any role, it's check user has any roles. Next, for the check user has single role, so it's check user has single role, and it's check user has single role. Next, for this remove roles from user, call the remove roles from user from your service layer, and you can give a message like removed role from the user. And with that done, for this assigned role to user, you just call that function from your service layer, and for a message you can give something like assigned role to the user. So that's it for our this endpoints, and at last you will also have to create this new user controller function. So it's new user controller function, which takes in your user role service interface, and it returns your user role controller interface, and inside it creates this user role controller wherein you pass the user role service as this function parameter, and it is your user role controller, and you just return it out. So this was our user role controller setup. So I hope is done. The final thing that we have to do is to create our routers. For our routers, what we are going to do is, at first, this is my package name as routers. So at first, why is it given an error? So it's multiple packages in the directory, main and routers. Okay. Yeah, so I believe there was some sort of bug which got fixed now. So here I'm going to create an interface for my router, right? So how it will actually work is that my routers, they will have, like, they need to implement this register function which is going to get a chi.mux. So what is this asterisk of this pointer of this chi.mux? So whenever you do something like this chi.new router, this R will be your chi.mux basically, or will be the star of chi.mux, right? It will be a pointer to your chi.mux. So this is what we are actually going to have. Now inside these routers, we will not have individual interfaces. We will just have our struct, which will be for, let's say that for our users router, we are simply first going to create a struct. So it's user router, and the properties that it is going to have is obviously my user controller. So the property name will be user controller, and it will be a type of my user controller interface. Then it's going to have a logger, and like not like this but like this, and then it is going to have a server config, right? So my user router struct will have these three properties, and I want this struct to implement my router interface. So you see, it is going to take a router by this of type pointer to this chi.mux, right? And for this rename and for this signature, I wanna rename this. So yeah, now it's looking fine. And how this will actually work is, inside our chi router there is something known as a routing groups. So you see, whenever you do this r equals to chi.new router, this r or this router will be a pointer to your chi.mux. So to that, you can create a group like this. So just come over here and you just call the router dot, is it route or was it, yeah, sorry, it is this route dot group. So it's route dot group, or what you can actually do is, I'm not sure where it is, but yeah. So see, we are going to call this one. So instead of group, we are going to use this route function which will accept a pattern. So the pattern for this users will be something like /API/v1/users, and then there is going to be a function of r which will be a chi.router, and inside this we can set up our controllers, our controller function. So it will be r dot, see, this is how we can do it. So it's just r dot width, so this is the middleware, then dot get dot post or whatever, like here will be the method, and then the pattern, the relative pattern to this one, then the function name. So that is exactly what we are going to follow. All right, so it's, see, inside our controller we had these ones. So it's create user, get all users, get user by id, update user by id, get user by id, and get user by email, get user by username and email. So here we have to establish those routes, right? So at first I'm going to create my get all endpoint. So it's r.get, then just give a comma and you just mention the function name. So it's user router dot user controller dot get all the users. Once that is done, the next thing that you have to do is to create the get user by id. So it's just get user by id, and for the path params you can mention them like this. All right, and next you have this create user as well. So r dot post slash comma user router dot user controller dot create user, then you will have a patch and a delete. So it's r dot put slash id and it's update user by id, then it's r dot delete pattern of slash id and it's delete user by id. So get all users done, get user by id, create user, update user by id, delete user by id, and then you will have your these two functions, which is get user by email, get user by username and email. So you can just create this as a slash get, and for now you can just mention something like slash user and you just say get user by email, and here will be get user slash, or not actually like this, but like let's leave these two functions for now. Let's just have this 5 functions, because again this is just the setup thing. So in the future we are going to change a lot of things from here, but yeah, for this setup thing I believe we do not need to use all the endpoints, right? And once this is done, you should create a new function by the name of new user router, which matter of fact accepts all the properties of the struct as your function parameters. So just go ahead and do this thing, and it returns my router interface. So if you remember, inside this we have this router interface, right, which has this register method. So here we created this user router struct which implements this router interface, right? Hence it has this register function, right? And here it is, basically establishing all the user related routes, right? Makes sense. And inside this function you just create a new instance of this user router. So it's and of user router, and for the user controller it's user controller, for the logger it's logger, for the server config it's server config, and it is also going to return this thing out. So you see, it was that simple, right? So you can just copy paste this and you can just go ahead and do the same thing for your routers as well, right? So once that is done, come to your roles router. So this is my role router, so it will accept my role controller interface, and for the register method it will be on my role router, and for my register it is going to be API slash v1 slash roles, then r.get slash, then it is basically my role router dot role controller dot get all roles, then for slash id it is, wait, let me just rename all of these instances by my role router, and the same thing for these as well. Next, get all roles is done. Next it will be get role by id. Next it will be create role. Next it will be update role by id. Next it will be delete role by id. Once that's done, you will have this new role router which will accept my role controller interface, and it returns this router interface, and here it will create this new role router, and for the controller it will be role controller, and it will be the same as our function parameters, right? And with that done, our role router is done as well. And with that done, I am going to do the same thing for my user role router, right? So it is user role router, it's user role controller interface, and this register will be defined on my user role router, and here it's going to be user roles. So here what I am going to have is my, at first let's first rename these instances, right? So just role router dot role controller. Instead of that, we have our user roles controller dot, sorry, our user role router dot user role controller. Now the endpoints which I am going to have is at first slash user slash id, or my user id, which will be helpful for getting the roles of my user, and it's going to be a get request. Next it will be a post request to assign a role to my user, so it's slash assign, and the function will be assigned role to user. Same goes with my remove, so it is going to be remove role from user. Then we are going to have functions for checking if a user has a single role or all roles or any role. So it will be for now a get request for all three, and it will be slash check single, and it will be user role controller dot check user has single role. Then it will be basically check all, so the function name will be check user has all roles, and at last it will be check user has many, so check hyphen any, and it will be check user has any roles. So with that done, you are going to have another function which is this new user role router, and the controller will be user role controller interface, and it is going to accept my zap logger and server config as well, and it returns a router interface. And for the variable it's going to create is basically the user roles controller, so it's the user role router. And for the user role controller, it's basically the one as the same as of my function parameter, and it's going to just return this thing out. So with that done, again my setup for my router is sort of done, so just push them out. And for the message you can give something like set up the routers, set up the app routers, and then just push them out. Fine. So with that done, what you have to do now is a pretty simple thing. So you see, we have created these routers. Now we have to orchestrate these routers. So for doing that, just come to your routers main.go, where we created this interface, and inside this what I want you guys to do is have a simple function which will be used for orchestration by the name of register routers. And what it is going to take is my simple logger, so it's going to take my zap logger, my MySQL database, and my server config, and what is it going to return is my simple she.mux, and it is going to return a pointer to that, right? So here the couple of things which we have to do is, number one is the create the router instance, then number two, create all repositories, then create all services, then create all controllers, and finally create all routers. And then if you remember, for this individual router we had this register function, right, which will just register the endpoints, and it will set up the appropriate controller for the particular endpoints. So once the routers are created, we just register them. Fine, right? And at the end we also need to return this router. So let's get started. So create the router instance is very easy. It's just chi.new router. So you will be able to see that it is star of chi.mux, and at the end I want you to return this same thing, and it can use my logger middleware. So it's a router.use middleware or it is middleware dot logger, not a function but like this. Then we need to create all our repositories. So for creating our repositories, it is repository dot new user repository, and it takes three things: the database, the zap logger, and the server config. So just pass them over here. So it takes the db, the logger, and the server config, and over here I'm going to rearrange the parameters in a similar fashion. So this is my user repository. Similar to that, I'm going to create my new role repository, right? So it is again going to return me my role repository, and at last I will have a new user role repository, which is going to return me a user role repository. Now the next step is to create the service layer, right? So for this, you just call the services dot new user service, and it takes quite some parameters. So it takes the user repository, logger, server config. Alright, so just pass the user repository, then pass the logger, and then pass the service or the server config. So I'm going to store it out in my user service variable. The same thing will be in case of my new role service, which will take this role repository, and it is going to be my role service, then my new user role service, which takes in my user role repository, and its name is going to be user role service. And there is some bug which tells me that there is some error. So oh no, there was no error, there was just a bug, right? And once that is done, you have to create your controllers. So controllers dot new user controller, it takes in your user service, it takes in your logger and your server config, and it returns me my user controller, है ना? So user controller, then the same thing will work for my new role controller, which will take this role service. Now once this role controller has been done, go ahead and create your user role controller. So it's going to be your user role service, and it's going to be the user role controller. Once that's done, you have to create your routers. So it's routers dot, not router, or is it? Okay, so where is that new user router? Yeah, so it takes in our controller. So pass in your user controller, pass in your logger and your server config, and it is basically my user router, right? In a similar fashion, I will have my new role router, which will take this role controller, and over here as well it will be role router, and then it will be a new user role router, which will take in your user role controller, and the router name will be user role router, right? Now once we have created our routers, we have to register them. So it's basically user router dot register, and if you remember, they take in a variable which is a property, which is a type of pointer to this she.mux, but that is exactly what our router variable is. Next, go to your role router, and finally your user role router. So once that is done, what I want you guys to do is come back to your app/main.go, which is this one, and inside this, if you remember, we had this handler of nil, right? So now what you have to do is you just have to call that routers.register routers function, which is going to accept a couple of things, which is number one, the db is with us, so that's not a problem. Then we need to pass a logger. The logger is again something that is with us. Then we need to pass a server config, and that is something that, okay, yeah, that is also something that we do have. So it is basically app.server config, right? So you see, that was that much easy to orchestrate everything. And till this point, what I want is I want to push the code. So for the message, I can give something like, yeah, it can be a feat of create dummy endpoint flow, right? So we just API endpoint flow, then push it. So like we just saw how the entire process or the flow line is actually going to work. Now once that is done, you will see that whatever changes that we have made, they will not be immediately available. So we just have to cross it, and then we again need to do this go run main.go, right? So a very good solution to this problem is air. So if you come to your air, there I do believe that they have this airverse package, and this is what we use. So this is what we use for live reloading. So for Node.js, just like how we have nodemon, similarly like that we have this air package, and the way to install it is first execute any of this command and just install it, and once that is done, just type air in it. That will create this air.toml file, wherein you have to be very careful with this cmd, where like this is where you have to explicitly mention. And similarly for our, if you scroll down a bit, you will see that build.windows is a section. Go ahead and do the same thing. So just give a slash over here and a slash over here, and that should work fine. Now to run it, just type air and it will run our server on hot reload, right? So you see our server is working fine. Now if I go to this /http/localhost/user, we get to see that it is 404 page not found, because it is /API/v1, right? And you see we are getting this success message. So I hope you got the flow of it. And if you see that we also got this logs, right? So it first called this user service. So from our user router, it will go to first our user controller. Then from our controller, it will come to my service layer. Hence this got printed first. Then from my service layer, it will make call to my repository layer. Hence the repository call came later. So you see that was how easy to set up this entire thing. So I think that in this lecture we discussed a lot about a lot of things, right? So we did a lot of setup thing, and I believe that is pretty good. And this air thing, I want to actually create a new task for it, so that every time I don't have to do air, I have to call air, right? I will just call this function and it will be def. Alright, so it is, the description is to start the server using air for hot reload, and the commands it will run is air, right? So let's test it out. So currently it is, I closed it, so our API is down. Now if I do task-l, which will show me all the tasks, I can just call task of def, which will call this air command, and it will start the server using my air. So now if you see, our API is up and running, right? So let's push them out. And for the commit message, I will give something like setup air and create, or let's just leave it to setup air for hot reloading. I just push the code out, and once this thing is done, what I want to do is, if you, okay, what am I doing? So if you remember, we are in our project setup branch. Now let's merge this to our main branch, because the next set of features are something that is a bit different from this project setup branch. So let's merge this to our main branch first, right? So this is our project setup branch. Now let me create a PR for this. So compare and pull request, and it is from my project setup to my main. And I will create a commit message using their GPT. Finally, I will just create a PR. and I will just merge this PR out. And once it's merged, you can see that it is merged. Now I will delete this branch. I will come to my local. I will check out my main branch. I will do a git pull, and finally I will also remove my this local branch, right? So if you see carefully, we just have one branch, which is this main branch. And now let me see if I have everything working fine as expected. So you can see that I have all this task. Now let me again do task def to see if air is running and starting the server. Yeah, see, now the API is up and running, right? Our server is working fine. So let's go back to the agenda. So here what we actually covered in this lecture was a bit too much. So we did this app config, we did this air setup, we basically set up our endpoints, right? So but now we have to write custom logic for them. So I hope you got the point, and I hope that you could catch up with the pace of my videos. So that's it for this lecture, guys. In the next lecture, we are actually going to create this authentication and user endpoints, which are for now just dummy endpoints, right? So yeah, that's it. Keep coding hard, guys, and I'll meet you in the next lecture.
Let me tell you about that VE. I'ma be your recruitment.